Good afternoon and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Aleshia Hayes is an educator, researcher, and developer focused on emerging technologies such as virtual reality, mixed reality, and the Internet of Things, as well as gaming and gamification. She's passionate about implementing, developing, and measuring effective, engaging, and usable educational technologies that simultaneously encourage critical thinking and respect of diverse learners and learning styles. She's worked on large-scale educational projects sponsored by NIH, NSF, the Department of Defense, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Today she will present a talk titled Ethical Delivery of Information in Virtual, Augmented, and Reality. Aleshia Hayes.
How's that? Good. Okay, virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. So I'm not going to talk about every way that we can present information in reality because that's like a PhD program that I didn't even attend. But what we are going to talk about today is ethics of presenting information in VR, AR, and mixed reality. And I should tell you a little bit more about myself, just the fact that my discipline really under computer science is an intersection of computer science, psychology, and communication, and it's called human-computer interaction. And this is a growing field that more and more people are majoring in, and that more companies are starting to encourage and or require their employees to be trained in. And the idea of mic check. I always wanted to do that. Check, 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 check. Wicca, wicca. Okay, I think we're good now. It seems like we're good. Awesome. Okay, so within human-computer interaction, one of the things that we focus on is the unintended consequences of choices that we make in development. So today, I'm going to talk about the differentiation between VR, AR, and MR for people who are not that familiar with these technologies. But then I'm also, for people who are familiar with the technologies, going to talk about what kind of information we portray in VR, AR, and MR, and then I'm going to conclude with the ethics of our decisions that we make with these portrayals, and specifically talking about unintended consequences of the decisions that we make as developers, but not just developers. Any stakeholder in this technology should be thinking about these things, as you guys are all different kinds of stakeholders, whether you're the consumer, you're the developer, you're the funder, you're the artist, any number of people. If you're the subject matter expert, you should be thinking about not only the intended consequences, but maybe some unintended consequences of the decisions we're making. So to get started with differentiating between VR, AR, and mixed reality, of course we have these beautiful pictures of what we think this technology is like, right? It's like, okay, this is a picture from the upcoming movie that I can't wait for, Ready Player One, and that is kind of a fictional, for now, portrayal of what reality can be once we get fully immersed in the virtual world. But there's a continuum that I generally tell everyone about that was created by Milgram and Kishano in 1994. So this has been around for a while. A lot of people are like, oh, VR, it's the new thing. And now that Oculus created this thing, now everyone can use it. And it's like, well, actually, people have been researching VR for quite some time. Milgram's continuum, though, I'm a big fan of because it does this thing where it explains levels of immersion and on a continuum that he calls reality to virtuality continuum. So right now, we're in, well, unless you're watching this as a video, we're in a real environment. An augmented reality environment is something where you have digital images portrayed over real physical objects Augmented virtuality is this idea where you add small objects to virtuality. Honestly, there are a lot of people, which I'll mention, for instance, Magic Leap right now, that I would consider more augmented virtuality on Milgram's continuum. However, to make things more complicated, yay, fun, to make things more complicated, while Milgram calls all of this mixed reality, people now are generally calling mixed reality this idea where you can mix in a virtual environment physical objects, and there can be some interaction between the virtual and the real. So the idea, for instance, with the Magic Leap, is that not only, like when you look at something like Pokemon Go, you have this world. Let's do that again. You have this world where I can have a Pokemon on my couch, and I can catch it with augmented reality. The augmented objects do not interact with the real world, right? They're just there. They're overlaid. And you can even see the little button at the top. You can even turn off the augmented reality and go totally back into the virtual space if you want to. I also caught a Pikachu on my keyboard. I just like that picture. I felt like sharing it. But this research has been going on for a while, and there are many different tools that people have come up with. Exposure therapy is a really good example of things that people have used that are not just gaming kind of applications for augmented reality, which we'll get into. And then also augmented reality, some Snapchat has this augmented reality spectacles glass where you can wear these glasses and take video. And from the way I understand it, you can like add filters and things. So these kinds of filters are what we're used to in everyday life now. Everyone's pretty much using these kinds of augmented reality if you're someone who uses Instagram or Snapchat. And then this image is an image of Google Glass, which came out about 6 years ago for developers only. And what they found, and this is one of these things when we talk about with HCI, we want to consider unintended consequences, because what they thought would happen, we'll start with what they thought would happen. What they thought would happen with Google Glass was that people would put on these goggles, or these glasses, and they would have this heads-up display that would make all of their life better. Like their maps would just pop up when they needed them, and they would be directed to walk around in the bookstore, and they would be told if their friends were nearby, and all of this stuff. Not to mention, though, the kind of possible negative ethical implication of even more cognitive overload than we're already experiencing, this information overload. Probably, but we never even got so far to test that, because what they found was that people don't like wearing these. So they didn't even get past the developer stage because people didn't like, the developers didn't even like them once they got to using them. Once we were using them as a development team, we would do things like walk around, and people would be like, "Are you filming me? What's going on?" And we talked to, like, we did some user research and talked to some doctors and things, and doctors said things like, well, I don't want to be looking, it's different if I look up at a book to look at something for my patient, but if I'm looking at a screen like this, where you can't tell what I'm looking at because it's a heads-up display on these glasses, how is my patient going to feel when I'm sitting here looking like this, kind of like an idiot, scrolling through information while they're sitting in front of me waiting for me to respond to them? So these kinds of little things are things that hopefully we can think about in advance. And I think that Spectacle, I probably should have switched the location of these slides, because Google Glass came first, and now we have this Snapchat Spectacles. These have just recently come out, like in the last year or so. And they've kind of picked a more appropriate audience. And so it's like for the kind of people who are already going around, like some of my friends who randomly send me pictures when they see something funny happening in the real world, and then they just send it to me. Like things like that are like, okay, that's something that's a reasonable application. Oh, and then if you're talking about moving along this virtuality continuum, then we have virtual reality. This is all the rage. And I just totally shamelessly took advantage of this opportunity to share images of my children and my students who are my extended family. So like this is a picture from an experiment that a group of my students was working on to create a virtual library, and so we were demoing the virtual library. But that's the Oculus Rift that they're using. There are limitations for each one of these technologies, though. So this is the Oculus Rift. It costs about $599. It did cost $599. Last I knew, they lowered the price to $399. This is the HTC Vive. When I paid for it, it was $799. I'm not aware of a price change. And then this is the Samsung Gear VR, and it's like $129, and it's powered by your phone, so you have to have a phone. With these two devices, though, you need to have a computer that's upwards of $1,500 for them to work appropriately. So there is still, and we'll get to this idea also when we talk about ethics, the idea of access. So that's one of the ethical kind of dilemmas that you think of when you think about this digital divide that we've been talking about now for decades. The idea of people who have access to technology having advantages over the people who don't, and that perpetuating disadvantage in society. And then, of course, the HoloLens. This is what it looks like. And they have hand gesture recognition. I was going to show a video, but I'm probably going to run out of time if I do that. So I'll just say there's a video. If you want to follow this link, I should also point out this presentation is available on my Twitter page. So you can go to my Twitter page and have the whole presentation. But I did at least want to show you a video of how Magic Leap portrays their experience, because it is pretty mind-blowing. I have not experienced it yet, though. I can neither confirm nor deny how accurate their salesmanship is. So in theory, you have this ability to do all of the things that you normally would do on your desktop, but basically do them anywhere. And if it's like the Microsoft HoloLens, then it would also be powered, like self-powered, where you wouldn't need to connect it to a computer, and also wireless. Of course, there are limitations that come with things that are powered by themselves and wireless, as far as power draining, and also upgrade capacity, things like that. Kind of like my wireless device that I seem to replace every year because it gets better, or so they say. I think it gets better. But so one thing you should notice about the Magic Leap presentation, this idea of mixed reality, is the fact that one thing is things are static in their location. So normally in a VR headset, when you move around, things move around with you. And in this particular technology, like if I had on a HoloLens or the Magic Leap, theoretically, I would be able to open windows all around me, and it would be like they were actually located in my room after that. So when I turned around and I walked away or sat down, I would be able to be, oh yeah, where did I put that? And it would be right here available for me. I think there was originally some video with that. So what kind of information are we portraying in these devices across this continuum? So one of the projects that I worked on in grad school was this virtual or mixed reality classroom. So if you look at the comparison between like the real world environment, you have students and teachers physically, so back to that continuum idea, there's the physical world. All the way across that spectrum would be the virtual world, where you as the teacher would be a virtual character, and all of the students would also be virtual. Somewhere in the middle of that would be this mixed reality classroom. This is one example of a mixed reality classroom where the students are digital, but the teacher is physical. And there are many iterations of this that have been kind of prototyped, including instances where you have physical avatars of students, but they're still avatars that someone could go up and touch them for the purposes of things like proximity, because things change in real life. And we can't portray this very well right now in VR. Like the ability to walk up to someone changes their experience of your interaction, or the sense of touch, haptics in VR, that can change someone's behavior. So that's particularly relevant when you talk about something like teaching in a classroom, but it's also very relevant when you talk about something like the Department of Defense and military training. Currently in my lab, I guess also the reason why I showed you the pictures from my lab with my daughters, and that WizDish is the VR treadmill. And that's one of the limitations right now with virtual reality is you're really constrained to the space that you have set up in a room. So in the real world, you can walk indefinitely, I mean, with the extent of walls, but hopefully you have open doors and things like that. Whereas in VR, I can only walk to the end of this room, even if the world goes on 1,000 miles, because I can't walk through the wall. So VR treadmills, I should maybe go back and show you that again. So these VR treadmills make it so that you can pretty much walk indefinitely. So they have these, if you guys are interested in checking them out, actually in the Envision Center. In fact, the Envision Center has one that's much better than mine. So if you're interested in seeing what a VR treadmill is like, they have one set up, and they have demos on it. So then the other limitation that we have with virtual reality, since we're thinking about virtual reality as a tool for not just gaming, but also training and education, is the idea of separation between other people, between people who are engaged in a VR environment. And new technology is allowing us to do things like wirelessly connect multiple people in the same virtual space. So one of the areas that we particularly look at when we're talking about virtual reality is the sense of presence, which is the sense of being there in a virtual space. But we also really care about social presence, which is the idea of being there in a virtual space with someone else and your social sense of connection. There's something that falls in between these called co-presence, which basically means, think of it like you're sitting in a room with someone you don't really care if they exist or not. So co-presence is like, yeah, I'm here and you're here, big deal. Social presence is like, yes, I see you and you see me and we have some interaction. And that is one of the biggest barriers to people enjoying virtual reality, and I say this all the time. I'm a VR researcher and I don't particularly enjoy VR, which I think makes me actually a pretty good researcher because I'm not just the type of person who says, oh, VR is great for everything. And I also don't just think it's wonderful, I want to improve it. I think it has a lot of potential, and I think we have a long way to go, which is good because I'm not that old yet, and I have a whole career ahead of me. So, and you guys are definitely not so old that you don't have a whole career ahead of you, so you're probably going to be wanting to solve a lot of the problems that we've been talking about at Dawn or Doom this week. So, then this one I'd like to spend just a moment on. Sorry if you guys are a little terrified. This is actually virtual spider crawling on your skin, which I know, it's scary. I felt like this would be the point in time that I would be bored, so I thought I would add something interesting here that would excite me and hopefully you guys as well, if excitement also means fear, I suppose. Maybe this is an ethical question I should be asking myself if I've stepped over some boundary. But for the purpose of scholarship, this is actually relevant. So this virtual spider crawling on one's skin is actually used for exposure therapy. I don't know how many of you are in the social sciences or psychology, but when people have phobias, which a phobia by definition is an irrational fear. So some people are deathly, I think everyone, I shouldn't say everyone. I don't know anyone who actually likes spiders. There's probably someone in the room right now. But there are some people who are deathly afraid of spiders to the point where they will do things like crash cars and run away and have panic attacks and be hospitalized. That is kind of a terrible level of fear. And so we have these interventions that are supposed to help people who have these kinds of phobias. So exposure therapy is slowly exposing someone to a thing that they have a fear of. Well, what they found is that augmented reality is a brilliant way of doing this. And it's not just for fear of spiders, although that's pretty cool. They also use it for people who are claustrophobic, people who have social anxiety disorder. So there are many different tools. People who have fear of giving presentations, honestly. And they even use it for, outside of exposure therapy, they use it for training football players to throw passes and call field what are those plays? I think that's what they call them in football. So that's one example of some kind of information that we can portray in VR and augmented reality specifically. Another one that I'm a very big fan of, Nani de la Peña is she's actually won several awards. She's a journalist who focuses on VR journalism. So this is one example of a VR story that she has told. And her goal is to create empathy in people. So instead of just telling you a story, she shows you a story. But instead of just showing you a story, she makes you experience a story. So instead of just knowing, for instance, that there was just a flooding situation, a hurricane in Houston, she shows you what it's like to be there and trying to pull together your family, and what it's like to be a kid who has to go to school at night because they have to be bused hours away because the school in their town is flooded. So instead of just reading the story and being like, oh, that's sad, you actually get the experience. So I think that's a really great example of some of the stuff that we can do with virtual reality that makes it much more relevant than a lot of people think. They're like, oh, it's for games. Yeah, it's for games. But that's probably the least interesting part of what we can use VR for. But remember, this talk isn't just about what technology exists. This talk is really about ethics and unintended consequences of these technologies. So when we're talking about ethics, I like to just take a second and think about what ethics is. And ethics, with the study of ethics, we're studying, I think people sometimes say, the study of good and bad, or the study of how to do good, or the study of morality. And I think all of those things are accurate. And I spent some time reading like some Aristotle and Plato and Socrates to make sure that was a fair, accurate representation of ethics. But I think a better explanation when we think about ethics in terms of technology, I would relate it more to the idea from the Hippocratic Oath that doctors give of doing no harm. And thinking as technology professionals and consumers, any of the stakeholders, how could we possibly be doing harm with the technology that we are propagating, whether it's by buying it, whether it's by selling it, whether it's by developing it. And I have found this years ago, and I'm a big fan of the idea of unintended consequences. So unintended consequences can be positive. So a positive unintended consequence can be that serendipity, something that you're like, oh, I didn't know that was going to happen. Awesome, this is great. I have a very good example of this. An unintended consequence is if I put on a VR headset, this is actually really awesome. I wish I had put a video of it in here, but I'll just tell you about it. If I put on a VR headset and someone uses ultrasonic waves to send a sensation to my hand to make it seem like I'm touching something when I'm visually touching something, I feel it like I'm touching it. So I can pick up balls and manipulate things in virtual space and actually feel them with my hands. The unintended consequence that I think is mind-blowing, and the people who created this technology don't even understand why it works. I asked them. If I am holding something in my hand and the ultrasonic waves are coming from beneath my hand, and I turn my hand over, I feel the waves under my hand, but my brain tells me that I'm still holding the object above me, which does not make sense. And I'm not crazy. Like, they tested it with many people. But this was an unintended consequence of this technology. They had no idea this was going to happen. They just knew it was going to work directionally. And then they found out, because our brains are these massive, amazing machines that we still don't fully understand, that this was going to be what actually happens. So that's a small, positive, serendipitous, unintended outcome, right? Potential sources of problems and corresponding reduction in quality, different unintended consequences, like maybe losing time, because one of the things we talk about a lot with education and training in VR is negative training. So and the example I'll use is we're working in my lab right now on an ROTC trainer. So to train ROTC students on troop movement. So they generally have these drills, and they stand around and they do these V formation, and then people get behind them and it's shaped like a V, or they tell them to line up with their hand gestures, and then people get behind them and line up, and all these things that I am now learning that the military trains their cadets to do. But a potential negative outcome of this could be, if we design this poorly and they implement it anyway, then we could actually be training people in ways that are not so effective. Like maybe the fact that I'm using that whiz dish that I showed you, when they don't actually have a whiz dish and in real life they get down on the ground and crawl around, which I can't really simulate at this point, then maybe that's not training them adequately. But the worst thing is this negative or perverse, and I don't have any example of a perverse effect, but I can say a negative effect, which is the opposite of what is intended. So a negative effect would be if I train them to do the exact opposite of what they're supposed to do, and then they do that in a wartime situation, and they die, ethically, is that my fault? I would say yes. I would say I have a responsibility as a developer, and this is where this stuff gets kind of tricky, because as of right now, there aren't that, in fact, I don't know of any laws that directly attack people who create training situations that do negative training. But negative training is a very serious problem, and I actually have some examples. Not this, though. We'll go back to that. So here's an example of possibly, we don't really know if any of you have been hearing about all of the naval ship crashes that have been happening. I'm going to play this video, and then we can talk about it. Hopefully there's sound. Is there sound? I was hoping that there would be sound. Is there something I should do to make sound?
Missing tonight.
Ah.
Even more troubling is
Okay.
the second collision for a ship happened
We'll go back.
West Navy destroyer. Sailors missing, and tonight the question, how did it happen again? The USS John S. McCain colliding with an oil tanker in the waters off the coast of Singapore. 10 sailors are still missing tonight. Even more troubling, it's the second collision for a ship in just 2 months.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Here's ABC's Chief Global Affairs correspondent, Arthur Raddatz tonight.
Oh, darn.
Tonight, the crippled USS McCain is in port at a naval base in Singapore while searchers
Oh, darn.
work to find those 10 missing sailors. And
I think,
the Navy scrambles to find the cause of this latest accident.
can I pause it? Maybe it will buffer while I talk, and then I can play it. You know what it's about? So the idea, though, with this idea, or the idea with the idea, the idea with this example is that many people are having conversations right now about, obviously, what the video is talking about. What went wrong here? And there are many hypotheses about what went wrong. One of them is that, obviously, the soldiers or naval officers were not adequately trained for steering and piloting their ships. And they weren't adequately trained for navigation. And some of this comes to, we have no answers yet, and I'm not sure that we ever will, because they're probably classified. But the real question to me, as an HCI person, is could we have solved this with more training through simulation? Because one of the things that I've read repeatedly is that they were not adequately funded for their training. So could we have trained them more? Say again?
The charge that they were dismissed on was inattention to detail and what was going on around them.
Okay, and
Were you trained for that?
I like that you brought that up. And actually, in HCI, that's exactly what we study. So I'm sorry, what is your name? Joyce. So what Joyce said is that they were charged with inattention to detail, so basically not paying attention. But one of the things that we look at with HCI, and particularly we would look at it for something like this, with augmenting someone's experience of piloting a ship, because regardless of whether or not it was their fault, this is something that we should be able to prevent. I mean, this is, aside from lives lost, hopefully that's enough. Also, millions of dollars lost, and an international event, all of these things are problematic. So one of the questions that we talk about with HCI is how do we maintain people's attention when they're doing especially some kind of critical task like this. So at some level, you could blame the people. And almost every instance that we study in human factor psychology and in human-computer interaction shows, for instance, even Chernobyl, shows human error causing deaths and or dangerous instances. And most of the time, they could have been prevented with better design. And that's back to the unintended consequences and not forward thinking about how something is going to be used. And of course, this isn't an HCI talk, but I can at least address the fact that humans use technology and a context of the real world. And if we ignore the context of that real world, then we're doing them a disservice. And so, of course, that's probably why they don't charge people for these kinds of things, because, gosh, the lawsuits would just be crazy, and they would probably just never end if we were really able to hold people accountable for the things that they design at that level. But then again, maybe if we held people accountable. And, of course, the difficult and interesting ethics questions are the ones that we don't have an answer to, right? It's like I could take a position and someone could argue with me for days, and then they probably would change my mind, because even though we try to make these laws, they're really more fluid depending on situations. So we'll skip the video since it's not cooperating. But again, you can follow the link to this if you go back to the talk through Prezi. So, actually, that's the end. I kind of jumped ahead when we got to talking about unintended consequences. Sorry about that.
Another example of that is if you depend on your GPS to tell you where you're going, and in reality, the GPS has no idea that there's construction going on, and all of a sudden, if you're not paying attention to that and only turning when they tell you to turn, a lot of unintended consequences.
Oh, definitely. But do we hold Google Maps accountable? I mean, can we?
No, I mean, you have to be in touch with reality.
Yeah, exactly. So away from the quite so grim and bleak, I'll go back to the idea of augmented reality with Pokemon Go, because we're talking about ethics again, and the idea of doing no harm, and who's responsible. So here's an example, and maybe we won't be able to watch this video either. So we'll stop it there, actually. So trespassing to play Pokemon Go. Who's responsible? Is it Niantic's fault if you decide to come into my living room because there's a Pokestop in it? I would posit no. No, it's not Niantic's fault. You were probably raised badly. No, I'm joking. but in all seriousness, a lot of, excuse me, let me skip that. A lot of the problems that were coming up with Pokemon Go, with people trespassing, with people apparently walking over graves and things where people felt like their family members were being violated because people were just kind of like trotting through cemeteries because Pokestops are in cemeteries. People going in dangerous areas, people driving and catching Pokemon. All of these things that you would think, because I brought this up specifically because people frequently tell me when we talk about ethics, well, that's just common sense. But sadly, as college students, you maybe have heard this before. Common sense is not so common. And maybe we shouldn't even assume that it's common. So this idea of not entering dangerous areas while playing Pokemon Go, at some point, there's probably going to be someone who tries to file a lawsuit because a Pokestop was in somewhere very dangerous and they got killed, and it'll be up to a court to decide whether or not that's Niantic's fault or your lack of logic. And I guess I would ask you all, like, how many of you, I'll just poll the audience, how many of you feel like it would be Niantic's fault if there's a Pokestop, say, next to a power line? There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious. Okay, maybe. So I mean, these are interesting questions, I think mostly because there's not any definite answer to them. Of course, Niantic takes the position, I think they call it CYA, it's a legal term. If you don't know what it is, I'm not going to say what it is, you can look it up later. But basically, to prevent themselves from getting in trouble, a lot of companies take positions that maybe are even a little bit too conservative. And one example I have of this is with the Oculus Rift. Oculus Rift is the VR headset that is probably most prominently known right now. I had the opportunity to talk to Paul Merlucky, who's the founder of Oculus, and I asked him for money because not just because I'm desperate and greedy, but because I'm a professor who likes to do outreach. So I asked him for money specifically so that I could do outreach at middle schools and show kids VR technology, which is one of the things that I do. And He said, the lawyers told me that we can't do anything with VR with anyone under 13. And of course, this alarms me because I've been, as you see, putting my kids in VR, and I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Wait, what do we know about VR and minors? And he says, we don't know anything bad about it, but just in case, the CYA, just in case, we're not going to ever financially support something like that. Because by supporting it, that means we're advocating for it. And the lawyers have already decided, as you may or may not have noticed, it says on the Oculus and other things, for 13 and up. So, or it might say not for under 13. It says something to that effect, though. So then the question comes up, who's responsible if these kids are using virtual reality? And also another question comes up, when we're talking about access, if access is an ethical issue, and we're denying certain kids access because we're not providing VR in the schools, but schools that aren't worried about the 13 rule, but they just have all this money to buy VR technology, and they're doing things like highly engaging activities to learn biology. I just heard of a VR application where you could dissect a grasshopper. So lots of things that generally we don't have the resources to do over and over again. Now people have this access. So is this an ethical issue if we're only giving access to these experiences to the very, very most affluent groups of our society? If they're having opportunities to do mock surgeries in high school, at school, and this is even beyond the age thing now, because high schoolers are above 14. But as far as access goes, if we have a classroom full of people who have this access to the most immersive, most intricate kinds of VR experiences, and then we have a classroom full of students with books that we know weren't that interesting when we were in school, what do we anticipate the outcome is going to be? Do we anticipate any kind of a disparity? I think that we should. I think it would be logical to anticipate a disparity. And I recently saw a talk, and I sadly don't have the exact stats here, but that essentially said a 1% advantage over 15 years translates to a full separation socioeconomically, just 1%. And I would venture to say that this would provide more than a 1% advantage. And the last example that I'll give you as far as ethical considerations with virtual reality and augmented reality and the responsibility that falls on developers is the idea of Google Glass. And some people say, and I'm one of those people, who say maybe it wasn't just the developers not wanting to do it, maybe it was Google, again, the CYA, you guys are going to really have to look that up, saying that they didn't want to be involved and held accountable for some of the things that people were saying they wanted to do with Google Glass. One of the things that almost every student that I talked to about Google Glass thought would be really awesome to do with Google Glass is face recognition. So that sounds great, right? Like I just walked down the street, I met Joyce today, I save it in my database. Every time I see Joyce from now on, it's like, yes, Joyce. And I look like I'm like this cool, awesome person who remembers people. Yeah, and it's coming through my glasses. That's great. And that is ethical if I save it of my own database and you told me your name. But this gets a little tricky if I do a search with my glasses after taking a picture of you and then I pull up, because we live in this digital age, this information age, and now I pull up your Facebook profile and your LinkedIn, and if you're not so savvy at protecting your information, maybe your address. Oh, wow, time. So that is just one example of how something that seems really great could go really wrong. And my goal is never to say, because honestly, technology will find a way, kind of like in Jurassic Park, life will find a way. Technologists are going to find a way to make this stuff happen. Like Google said no face recognition. It took me 10 seconds to search YouTube and find someone who had already done it with their technology, even though Google said no. Google said, don't use our stuff to do this. And someone said, yes, we can and we will. So I'm not under any sense of imagination thinking that we can prevent people from moving forward with technology. But I do think that we can be smart about the way that we apply technology and with the limitations that we put on technology, and maybe coming up with ways to protect ourselves from the things as they emerge instead of sitting blindly, idly by. So since it's time, I will close with a Benjamin Franklin quote that I love, which is, "To fail to plan is to plan to fail." So just because we don't exactly know how we want these technologies to go or how we want them used doesn't mean we should sit quietly and let other people decide the future of technology. Because just like a smartphone not so long ago when I was in high school was unheard of, now this is the way of life. And my kids have never even known a world where this didn't exist. So if you think about that and the way the technology is evolving, my kids will probably not have any idea of what it's like to not have a world where we live in a mixed reality, where they're able to interact constantly with digital objects all around them. And that is time for questions. So do you have any questions? No questions? Oh, awesome.
With the age restrictions that they're putting on it for the covering themselves, do you think that it's even ethical for them to be releasing them to the public? Because, I mean, when I grew up, video games were, starting to become really big, and then parents at the time didn't realize, even what the rating systems were on some of the video games. And so my parents were buying me stuff that definitely was above my age restriction. And I know that there are kids that are, 8, 7, 6 years old that are playing in VR. So is that an ethical thing to even have it being released to the public, knowing that it could possibly get into hands of minors?
That's a really excellent question, and I guess I have a couple of responses to it. First off, like any good question, I don't know that there's a full answer, but my initial thought would be, like, for instance, with my children, I still let them use virtual reality, and just like you can use a television too much and people overuse video games, I think that part of the responsibility, and I think part of the reason why we should be talking about this, and like I said, all stakeholders, is because understanding the technology is your responsibility if you're buying it, at least at some level. Once they came up with rating systems for video games, I feel like that's the parent's responsibility. It's not that unclear. There's a giant sign on the front of the game that says 13 plus or whatever. So, and also, many technologists have said things like, well, why are parents letting their kids play video games for 6 hours, and where are they? If your kids are playing Call of Duty, my kids play Call of Duty, I have no problem with violence, so, and that you can debate with me later. But if you have no idea of what they're doing, then that's kind of your responsibility as a parent who has children. So I would kind of compare it to something like cigarettes or alcohol or owning a TV, or like even your example of owning a video game. It's like, yes, it's something that should be monitored because children are children, and that's why they're not adults. That they're supposed to be monitored. We have that age of 18 in our country for ostensibly a reason. Oh, yes.
Referring back to your training example, how you can. Oh, thank you. The training example and how you might be culpable for inattention on the part of the person when they go to the field to perform. Is there a body of work that gets into that? Because the reality is you cannot, or you make choices about what you're going to put in any simulation. And as far as things that people should be attending to, again, there's a lot to decide. How much are we going to put into a simulation versus what we'll wait for in a more realistic training session? Is there a body of work on that you know of?
So is there a body of work on, wait, that was a great question, but is there a body of work, are you asking if there's a body of work on the attention, or is there a body of work on lawsuits about inattention? Because I don't know of a body of work on the lawsuits.
Let me put it this way, good practice to avoid lawsuits.
I haven't seen any kind of body of work specifically focusing on litigation around these issues, although that would be an interesting book. I should check and see if that exists. But I have seen a great deal of work talking about attention, there are many articles on ways to keep people's attention, and there's the NASA TLX for measuring people's cognitive load, things like that. I would say, though, this is actually kind of where my lab fits in with all of this. My goal has been to help people define the efficacy of things that they create. And in my experience, that is something that is sorely missing from the community. So if something like that does exist, then I definitely need to read it, and maybe you need to write it. Because like the example that actually started me down the path that I chose in grad school was working on an NSF-funded experience and finding that there were little to no criteria for success, which to me, as someone who is very rubric-driven, because I've been in education for quite a while, I was looking for a rubric, like, okay, how will the NSF know that I did awesome or that I really failed? And there was no really clear way of measuring that. And I think that largely, and even with the example of the Navy training, I think that very often people pay for simulations and they pay for virtual experiences for training, and they think that because it's brand new and that other people are smart and working on it in a lab and they have PhDs and they've been studying this, it must be good. But very few people actually do full-on efficacy testing. Like they'll maybe do one area of testing. Like they'll say user experience testing. Oh, it feels good and people like it. And sometimes people say they like something just because it's new, by the way. Or they'll do testing like, oh, well, we asked them this specific question before, and then we asked them after, and they learned it, so therefore it worked. And it's like, in real life, things are much more broad than the evaluations that we use for these things. So I guess also I would say in terms of ethics, one of the things we really need to push is people's accountability. So, gosh, I really hate to say that here because I feel like as I'm talking, the more I'm thinking about it, the more it sounds like I'm saying that this needs to be litigious, and that's not really what I'm saying. But I do think we have a responsibility. And yes, I think that's a good idea, that body of work that you suggested, and I have not seen it. If you find it, please email me. Oh, yes, Joyce. Oh, sorry. I didn't see your hand.
I have a teacher voice. So
I was taking notes as you were leading up to that, and his question just opened the door. I think the technology is certainly outpacing the laws, for one thing, but it's also outpacing the research and the body of knowledge that says, even though iPads have been around for a long time, now we have 18-month-old, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds navigating through the iPad. Do we have a clue about what that means to us in terms of child development? Not really. And yet we put on here the acceptable things for an 18-month-old. I don't know.
That's several talks. but no, I think that's a really good point, the ethics of presenting this kind of material to young children. And you're right, first of all, we don't have longitudinal studies on any of this, but because it hasn't been around, like you said. But also, the ethics of testing these things on children is also questionable. If I have a question of whether or not something is potentially harmful to children, an IRB is never, ever going to approve me do that study. So the only way I could do it is by checking with people who have already exposed their children and comparing them to people who have not exposed their children, which, like you said, it's not been around long enough even for us to do that. I mean, there are some studies that indicate that there's already a declining attention. But then the other question I would raise is there a different kind of attention? Because, for instance, people for a great while were saying that people who played video games weren't very good at paying attention to things because they were overstimulated and they were so used to being overstimulated. But what they have also found in research is that people who play a lot of video games are better at multitasking. So there may be trade-offs that we don't know. Again, that's a serendipitous thing. Like, oh, awesome, you played video games all these years. You're not so good at focusing on me when I talk to you, but you're really good at multitasking. Awesome. Probably you don't want to train your children with that expectation in mind.
I think we should leave it there,
Oh.
since we're
darn.
5 minutes over.
Oh, sorry.
So-
Okay.
So thank you, Professor Hayes.
Thank you.